So we're getting in now to the 1830s. And I think by the time we get to 1830 or so, we can see emerging in Europe a kind of conflict in the wider field of Europe. I think we see a conflict emerging. And that conflict is, on the one hand, we've said this before, between the British system. By this time in 1830, the British system is informed by the science of Isaac Newton, by the philosophy of Locke and Hobbes, but also then the political economy of Adam Smith. By 1830, what we see developing in Germany, for the most part, if you kind of want to look back into the future to see a conflict that's going to arise later on, Germany by this point is probably coming most under the influence of Hegel. And I think there's something interesting in the sense that both the Newtonian Adam Smith system and the Hegelian system, they both offer a version of politics based on unredeemed human nature. In the sense that for Newton, Newton basically creates a world of love and strife. It's the world of Empedocles brought into a contemporary context. Love is gravity and strife is inertia. And Smith takes this idea, this scientific framework, and he creates individual self-interest and a kind of soft notion of the invisible hand is somehow the idea that God's providence, it's a kind of truncated version of God's providence. If everybody acts out of self-interest, God's providence will somehow resolve it all.
Is it also Lockean?
It's Lockean, yeah. It's Locke, Newton, and Smith, I would say, kind of combined. But God, in that system, God does not play an active role in history. On the other end, so what happens in Hegel's an interesting character because he's so ambitious, even though he gets a lot of things wrong. Right? So, but Hegel, I think, ultimately is trying to develop, and we teach this in modern philosophy, at least when I'm allowed to teach modern philosophy, when an expert doesn't come in to take my place, as happened last year. But Hegel essentially is trying to understand the mind of God. And I think he's trying to understand the mind of God from a Lutheran Protestant perspective. But I think by the time I think you can almost understand a little bit the life of Hegel as a way of kind of understanding his philosophical development, if you want to call it development. But as a young man in the 1790s, he's enamored with the French Revolution. He's also enamored with a Catholic girl. And this girl gets him interested in the Trinity and in the sacraments. Of course, by the 1820s, by 1831, his death, he's completely on it. He never, his relationship with his Catholic girl never matured. But by the time you get after 1800, Hegel is interested in understanding the mind of God, understanding the Trinity, and creating a philosophical theology that will reflect the mind of God working in history. Now, rather than going back to John Locke and Isaac Newton, actually Goethe, I don't know if you know this, but Goethe was violently anti-Newtonian. Goethe thought he was the finance minister of the Weimar Republic, or Weimar. So anyway, Goethe thought it was essential to develop a political economy that was distinct from both the Newtonian system and the system of Adam Smith. Some people speculate that Mephistopheles in Goethe's Faust is Hegel. Because part of Hegel's understanding of the mind of God is that God, in a way, so Hegel gets into this whole thing of the relation of opposition and the dialectic of negation. So Hegel can't say God is love. So he ends up saying that the Son is the negation of the Father. Right, which is absurd. But Hegel is doing this because he's trying to develop a philosophical theology which is distinctly Protestant and doesn't really rely on Catholic categories or anything that he thinks is connected with Catholic categories. And Hegel was apparently, he wasn't a great rhetorician, but he had this kind of ponderous way of meandering, so that by the time you get to 1815, 1820, people are paying to go to his lectures. And people get this sense that he's doing something that's important. It's going to be a foundation for us. It's not going to be Catholic, and it's not going to be English either. So what Hegel ends up doing is he ends up kind of, by the end, even though he starts out in the 1790s as an advocate of the French Revolution, and even in 1806, he thinks that Napoleon riding into Jena is the world spirit riding in on horseback, right? But not long after that, he becomes an apologist really for the Prussian state. And I think a little bit what he ends up doing is he ends up kind of trying to come up with this notion of the Trinity as negation and contradiction. And it's from this negation and contradiction that you end up getting what we call the dialectic of history. But for Hegel, it's a dialectic of the spirit. What will happen is that some followers, some people that pick up on Hegel, Feuerbach among them and Marx, will say, we don't need the spirit. We can just apply the dialectic to matter, to material history. So you get dialectical materialism.
If matter is spirit, well, maybe spirit is just matter.
But see, so Hegel was trying to avoid that, because that was Spinoza, right? Spinoza says that substance is all that there is, and spirit is contained in substance.
Sorry, what do you mean by the dialectic? Because Socrates also have dialectic.
The dialectic, the great example of dialectic is that there is the Father. The Son is the negation of the Father.
Mm-hmm.
That's the beginning of dialectic. So you get these movements of change where one thing that changes is the opposite or the denial of something that's in the thing that it's trying to change. That's the beginning of the dialectic.
Oh, okay. So the struggle of social class in Marx is technically one over another.
So basically, the struggle of social class in Marx is it's denying the spirit, the aspect of the spirit, and it's saying you can look in history scientifically. In one age, one group prevails, and then that's the thesis. And then that age is challenged by the antithesis, some group that challenges the power of the thesis. That's the antithesis. And in the challenge or in the violence that results from those two, you get the third thing, which is the hypothesis or the synthesis. The synthesis. The new power that emerges. I think another aspect of Hegel that's interesting here is that the aspect of unreformed human nature that Hegel succumbs to in the end is the Lutheran notion of the enslaved will. Right? For Luther, essentially, you can sin, and you sin boldly, right? Is one of the mantras of Luther. But essentially, you can't help but sin. And also, I think ultimately in Luther, because he was a nominalist, the divine will is arbitrary. So when Hegel comes up with kind of a notion of history, he doesn't come up with the invisible hand. He comes up with the Prussian state, right? The Prussian state, which somehow God has placed in the contradictions of history to embody and to bring forth progress by embodying kind of the Lutheran Protestant pinnacle of history. So, ironically, in Hegel, you get an unreformed human nature acting that's embodied by the Prussian state. And actually, towards the end of his life, Hegel says, sometimes war is necessary, right? Sometimes a state like Prussia or some other state, it might have to engage in war in order to bring out, in other words, that through that contradiction, it will bring out, maybe sometimes even in unintended ways, it will bring out what is the progress of the spirit in history. So kind of what you see being set up, I think, between England and Germany at this point is two systems based on kind of a kind of de-Christianized, truncated version of Christianity in both cases. Unreformed human nature and a state that somehow thinks of itself as acting quasi-providentially with a system that is imposed on unreformed human nature. In this context, we also get various movements. It's also within this context we get the rise of Romanticism. Now, I think obviously, just to say something here also about Hegel and Smith, that ultimately both those versions are defective, and they can be corrected by a correct understanding of divine providence and a correct understanding of human nature. Right? The divine providence does work in history through secondary causes. And those secondary causes, they can do good, but they can also commit sin. So they can work towards the common good. They can also introduce customs and habits that lead away from the common good. But God can draw good out of evil. And so sometimes, despite the mistakes that they make, God can still move history forward according to his designs. In the French context in the 1820s and 30s, obviously there's the Republic of Letters, represented by the likes of Victor Hugo. But within Catholic circles, you also start to get these debates about the nature of democracy and the relationship between the church and the state. You get a continuation of some of these debates. One fellow that's very important for, I think, both for the development of Marxism and also for the development of democratic theory is Félicité de Lamennais. Félicité de Lamennais. He grows up in the 1990s in France. So there's some things that are alike in which Athanasius and Lamennais are alike. So Athanasius, as a young man, his mother was so concerned about him getting martyred that she essentially got him locked into a library. Athanasius had the good advantage of being able to read really ancient Greek stuff. Félicité Lamennais, also as a young man in the 1990s, 1790s, early 1800s. His dad also locks him in a library to protect him. His dad also hid during the French Revolution refractory priests who refused to take vaccines. To take the oath of loyalty to the French Revolution.
His father?
So Lamennais' father hid refractory priests.
Oh, okay.
Priests who refused to take vaccines. Priests who refused to take the oath of loyalty to the revolution.
How do you spell Lamennais?
Lamenais.
Whoa, I would never got that.
It's spelled just like it's pronounced. If you know French.
Let's add an ET instead.
Rafa could come and pronounce it for us and spell it properly. Rafa can do everything. So the problem is his dad's library was a typical library of an 18th century Frenchman, which means it was a hodgepodge of eclectic material from the Reformation to the present. So Montesquieu, Montaigne, Voltaire, Pascal, Rousseau. It just had everything in it with no real rhyme or reason. Lamennais in 1815, he and his brother, Jean-Louis, they become ardent defenders of Catholic dogma, criticizing the excessive emphasis on freedom and the understanding of false freedom that comes out of the 18th century. How freedom was poorly understood. How so many people in Europe were becoming more and more, in an unhealthy way, detached from the Pope and his authority. How in the 18th century there was no Catholic action to defend the rights of the church and society. that there was little attempt by Catholics to Christianize the social order and social institutions, that there was very little sense of the mission, especially of lay people. He didn't use these words, but I'll just use them right now. To evangelize. And this led the vast majority of Catholics in Europe to become indifferent to political and social movements. They tended to obsess over devotions, and they became excessively obsessed with religious practices. So Lamennais and his brother became convinced in 1815 that it was necessary that there be Catholic action in society to build up the kingdom of Christ, that the Pope and the throne could work together, that we should look back to the time of the first Christians, when revelation was first received. So as an example for how to reinstantiate the kingdom of Christ in the world. They said we need to look at those examples, not reason, not tradition, just for the sake of tradition, and also not naturalism. Naturalism would be one of these philosophies that is unreformed human nature. So de Lamennais and his brother were teaching that if we return to primitive revelation, united with the Pope, Catholic action with energy, nurturing true freedom, we could promote in society the true nature of liberty. And that de Lamennais would also start to teach, he also taught that, you can't be afraid of true liberty, right? The true freedom of Christ. So Catholics should take the upper hand here. The monarch should promote liberty, even if it has to critique individualism. We should promote liberty wherever we can, and so as to give freedom its true meaning. So de Lamennais starts to argue that while many of these movements of the late 18th, early 19th century were defective because they had a poor understanding of liberty, that the best thing to do to build up the kingdom of Christ would be to affirm their love of liberty, affirm the freedom. Chant USA, because it's a country that loves freedom.
Sort of sounds like Tocqueville. He's not Catholic, but
Well, but he's probably, I'm sure he was aware of de Lamennais. I'm sure we'd have to we could do someone should do a dissertation on that.
but Tocqueville is also enamored,
Yeah. So de Lamennais is doing this, and then also throughout Europe, de Lamennais is promoting his ideas in the 1820s and into the 1830s. But de Lamennais is going to undergo a change because, by the way, there was an Irish thinker in this time, David O'Connell, who also was very influential in picking up on the ideas of de Lamennais and applying them to Ireland, especially to Southern Ireland. So in the 1820s and 1830s, the spirit of revolt starts to rise again in Europe. As we explained in the last class, in the 1820s in France, the royalists, Charles X, they get a hold of the throne because they allow for popular elections. By 1830, the liberals are successful in limiting suffrage so as to basically to try to put limits on the rule of Charles VIII, the 10th. The liberals, one of the heroes that they try to resurrect from the French Revolution is Lafayette. And by the way, the liberals that engineered ultimately their return to power in 1830 in France, they were moderate liberals. So they wanted the bourgeois values of economics. They wanted to promote, capitalist economics. a lot of these liberals in the 1830s in France, one of the mantras of the moderate liberals became, if you want to have a say in politics, get rich, right? In other words, so one of the ways they limited franchise or they limited suffrage was by saying basically you had to be worth like $100,000 a year in order to vote, right? So they would so they were moderate liberals in the sense of they were economic liberals, like, you know, if you can get rich, then you can vote and you can have a say in society. In Belgium, what's interesting in Belgium is that in Belgium in the 1820s, the moderate liberals had control of the government. And in Belgium, both the Catholics and the radical liberals were unhappy with the rule of the moderate liberals. So the Catholics and the radical liberals united in order to kick the moderate liberals out of power. And essentially what happened in Belgium in the 1820s and 30s is that the radical liberals and the Catholics, they worked out a kind of modus vivendi. And so they agreed to the first really, it wasn't a doctrine of separation of church and state, but they agreed to a kind of practical separation of church and state, understood as the government will just do its thing, but it will just ignore what the church does. So the point here is that in many European countries, if you go back to a point I was making earlier, in many European countries, moderate liberals thought it was essential to put limits on what the church could do, to not allow Catholic schools, to not allow the free function of the religious orders. Why? Because they knew they needed to take over the institutions. So the radicals in Belgium, they basically come to kind of an agreement where they basically say, look, so long as we share in the government and we can implement our economic policies, we'll let the church start its own schools. We don't care. We'll just pretend like the church doesn't exist. That's the origin of the Louvain. The Louvain in Belgium was started during this time, basically because the government that came into existence, it kind of was a practical application of, it was separation of church and state understood in the terms of like, well, you can do whatever you want in our country. You can start your own free, your own school, your own Catholic school. You can have all your own Catholic high schools if you want. So long as we have a say in the government and in the economic institutions. By the 1820s and 30s in Poland, Poland didn't really have its own country. The Poles in a way at this time, it's interesting, by the 1800s in Poland, by the early 1800s, most of the intellectual leadership, even within the church, had gone over to the Enlightenment. When you read statements about, so the Poles were like, they were very willing to incorporate the rhetoric of the French, the rhetoric of revolution, the rhetoric of freedom, all the rhetoric that the French Catholics were fighting against for Poland. Why? Because they wanted to free themselves from Russia. They wanted to free themselves from Prussia and Austria, right, to establish their own nation. So
even though they are Catholic, but they still embrace
much of them had gone over kind of to the Enlightenment, to these ideals. In fact, at one point, it got so bad in the 1820s and 30s that the Russians kicked out most of the Polish intellectual leadership, exiled them to Paris. And in Paris, the Polish leadership came into contact with Lamennais' study circles. Lamennais kept looking. Some people would joke that Lamennais was a flaneur. You know what a flaneur is? A flaneur at this time was a specific French word about. It was someone who didn't really work, just kept walking through the streets waiting for a revolution to happen so that he could join it. That's a flaneur.
like woke.
Yeah.
The French woke.
It's the French woke in the 1820s and 30s, yeah. So Lamennais in this time, he starts a journal called L'Avenir, the future. And he started this journal because he thought in the 1820s and 30s, something is happening. Big changes are on the horizon. during the lockdown, the economy has changed and everything is changing. There's going to be a new normal, right? So he started this journal called L'Avenir, the future, to try to help have a say. He wanted to have a say in what the future would look like. And then basically in this journal, he promotes almost anything that's dedicated to revolutionary freedom, including now embracing the separation of church and state as a theory. He starts to argue that if we have the complete separation of church and state, if the church is led by men of energy and enthusiasm, if they are led by vital energy, and this term vital energy gets used to our day. Actually, you can start to see it in philosophy and in Catholic theology. The search for vitalism, vital energy, right? By the mid 1830s, he decides that this vital energy is no longer in the monarchy, and it will never be in the monarchy again. This vital energy can only be in the Pope and the will of the people.
What does Rome say about separation of church and state?
So, thank you for asking that question. It's the next part of the lecture. So, basically, by I think it's 1835, Lamennais and some of his one of his followers is Montalembert, a kind of quasi-famous French Catholic liberal. He becomes friends with Lord Acton later on in the century, an English liberal, an English Catholic liberal. So Lamennais decides, so he gets rejected by most of the bishops in France. Now, by the way, Lamennais, he's a person by the 1830s, he's kind of unstable. I mean, people who meet him kind of sense that he's a little unstable, that he's so, like he's a proto-revolutionary almost. So in 1835, and when he kind of sours on the monarchy, and he says we need a union of the Pope with the people. This is the only way to bring about the energy of a democratic revolt, relying on the common sense of the people so as to direct everything towards the good, towards the transformation of the whole society according to the kingship of Christ. So basically, when he's complaining to some French bishop or cardinal that no one's accepting his ideas, because again, at this point, most French Catholics are either mild or radical monarchists. This bishop says, well, if you think the Pope and the people need to be united, maybe you should go talk to the Pope about it. So this convinces Lamennais and some of his followers that they should make a pilgrimage to Rome to basically talk to the Pope about his confection of ideas and to get the Pope to somehow endorse it. Endorse building the kingship of Christ. Endorse not naturalism, but embracing the people, embracing the will of the people, along with the separation of church and state. That's his formula for success. So in 1835, he goes to Rome to demand from the Pope the support of the freedom of the people in Europe. The Pope receives him in 1835 and then does the classic Roman, there's a great, I don't know if it's a virtue, but it's a habit that they've cultivated in Rome over the years. It's called Romanità. A great example of Romanità is when Hesburgh got Rockefeller. So Hesburgh and Rockefeller kind of became buddies in the 1960s. And because Rockefeller, he had already got the doctrine on birth control changed in a number of other churches, Protestant ecclesial communities. So he thought, I can do this with the Catholic Church as well. And Hesburgh kind of played this game with him that maybe you can. So Hesburgh got an audience between Rockefeller and Paul VI. And so when Rockefeller was there in Rome, going into the meeting, apparently he wrote out and prepared every word meticulously, everything he wanted to say. And when the cardinal greeted him to bring him into the Pope, Rockefeller told the cardinal he was super nervous. And the cardinal the cardinal, treated them nicely, kind of fun, was affectionate with them and said, well, don't worry, just go in, say whatever it is you have to say. The Pope is going to listen to you. He's going to be, kind of did everything to calm him down, to be generous, to affirm him. We're here to listen. We want to hear everything you have to say. And so the Rockefeller apparently went into the meeting. He started to kind of stumble. He missed some things, and he got nervous because he was in the presence of the Pope. And then as he was leaving, he turned to this cardinal and he said, oh, I don't think I was able to make my case the way I would have liked to. I missed some points. And the cardinal said, well, don't worry. You go home, get calm, write down everything that you think, write it all down, everything you wanted to say. And you just give it to me, and I'll make sure the Pope sees it all and we'll study it all, right? That's Romanità. I'm sure this cardinal had no interest in taking Rockefeller seriously, right? But there's just this kind of, and I've experienced it myself in some of my dealings with people in the Vatican, right? They just cultivate this sense of, we welcome you, we greet you, we affirm you, we want to hear what you have to say. A lot of times, people who are unscrupulous will use this to try to say, oh, they've accepted my position, right? So you'll see someone they'll put on Twitter, I'm going to see the Pope tomorrow, right? And then they'll see the Pope and they'll say, the Pope listened to everything I said. He seemed so encouraging. He told me he loved what I do. He encouraged me in this. He encouraged me in that. That's Romanità. That doesn't tell you at all what the Pope really thinks, right? All that tells you is that he's acting like popes and cardinals have acted for the last 500 or 600 years, right? Just cultivating this sense of, well, this is how they treated Lamennais when he came to Rome, right? They were welcoming. The cardinals said yes, blah, blah, blah. But then they delayed. Then that's the sign that they really don't believe what you think, right? They don't respond, right? They delay. That's part of the diplomacy of the church, is just to wait.
Yeah.
We can wait out.
All things bad.
We can wait out the storm. We can wait for 200 years if we have to. If the church says something that's true and it just knows that people aren't receiving it, it can wait 300 years to say something about it again, right? So it's also the case. Just because something was written 300 years ago doesn't mean it's not true anymore. Sometimes you'll hear people say that. Oh, the church said this. The last time the church spoke on this was in this encyclical in 1748. Therefore, it's not valid anymore. Well, no, that's not necessarily the case. It might just be the church thinks it's in a time it can't speak about that, or no one got around to it, or no one feels confident to speak about it, so it doesn't say anything. It doesn't mean it's changed, right? So in this kind of time of waiting, actually, many of de Lamennais, like Montalembert was one of them, sympathizers, they basically realized the Vatican's not going to give us the answer we want, so they left. They left Rome. They went home to Paris, but de Lamennais stayed in Rome. And he basically insisted on getting some sort of a pronouncement. And the pronouncement he got was Mirari Vos. And in Mirari Vos, Gregory XVI condemns the doctrine of the separation of church and state as a wicked doctrine, as a wicked teaching, one that the church could never embrace. The church and the state operate in two separate spheres, and one has nothing to do with the other.
So it is Gregory
the 16th. Mirari Vos. Read it and weep.
Are you going to go more into that?
I don't think I need to. It's in other words, the only thing I'll say is that, so de Lamennais understood this as a direct critique of everything that he was saying. That somehow Gregory was saying that the church is somehow against modern freedom, it's against energy, it's against the will of the people, it's against the separation of church and state, and it's against the idea that any state could be prophetic in how it implements the social kingship of Christ. So so this is, I mean, I think also it's important to remember at the same time that Gregory VI condemned de Lamennais' theory of the separation of church and state, he praised it as it was put into practice in Belgium. The difference is that in Belgium, there was no theory. It was the practical agreement that the politicians came up with that actually allowed for the freedom of the church. And it prevented the persecution of the church by the state. So it basically beat back the territory where the state, and it says, so Gregory thought, well, we can make a concordat with Belgium. Right? But we could never make a concordat with a nation that started out with the separation of church and state if the separation of church and state means that the church can do nothing as far as acting in society. Right? Because Lamennais was coming from France, where separation of church and state essentially means the church can't act in society. And priests and bishops can't say anything in public life. Can say nothing. Right? So you have to be careful about how you understand some of these ideas, right? So when it condemns the notion of separation in church and state, it's condemning a kind of radical notion of the idea. At the same time, Gregory VI approved but it wasn't a theoretical separation of church and state. It was a practical working out of it, but it actually wasn't separation. It wasn't, because why? Because it's allowing the church to start a university and run all the high schools in Belgium. That's not separation of church and state. Because separation of church and state a theoretical understanding of separation of church and state, according to the Enlightenment, would mean the church can't start schools. The church can't run universities. The church can't do anything that might affect public life.
So under that definition, there wasn't separation in, say, this country, for instance, where the church was doing all sorts of things publicly. And
Exactly.
No one was bothering it.
Exactly. So you got to be careful when people say separation of church and state.
Yeah.
I think it is best to say, let's not talk about it. I mean, that concept doesn't really describe reality. I think that's what Gregory VI was trying to get after. All right, there's too much baggage connected with the concept. So let's just look at the reality. And I think the idea that got promoted throughout the 19th and into the 20th century was, let's pray for the freedom of the church. Let's get the church the freedom so they can act. Which actually is a limitation on the power of the state. And I think actually, if you study the history of this question, if you kind of like start to separate out the myths and the dark legends and the black legends, right, that are in people's minds that have been promoted really since the ancient world, which are false. The bigger problem throughout history is the encroachment of the state on the power of the church. Right? That's by far the bigger problem. Yes.
I mean, reminded like Philip Hughes's Popular History of the Catholic Church in some ways just a story about this question.
Yeah.
But, like the state is constantly trying to use the church or take it over, and so the whole history is like the church's fight for freedom.
Right.
I want to understand why the Middle Ages is so great. Is because the Pope was able to get freedom finally from the Holy Roman Emperor for 2 centuries.
Right.
France then came and then things.
Yeah. Right. So I think I think especially in societies that have been infected with the virus of the Enlightenment, right? That we tend to think as a default way of thinking. Our prejudice is like, I remember one time, our prejudice tend to be that the church has done all these terrible things to impose herself on the state, and therefore, once we establish the separation of church and state, the state will finally be free, and the people will finally be free to act outside of the dominion of the church, right? So one year, one of my first years teaching, I was teaching a course in religion and politics, and they told me at Notre Dame, you should never mention like the church or the magisterium of the church or anything related, anything like too Catholic on the first day of class, right? That's like a custom at Notre Dame. So I'm teaching a course, philosophy 200, whatever. second philosophy course, religion and politics. So what are you going to do on the first day of class? So I thought, well, if there's any class to test this theory, it's this class. So, I give this, I hand out the syllabus, I give the standard introduction, and I said, well, so this class is religion and politics. So, in the last third of the class, right, we'll discuss questions about the relationship between church and state and whatnot, and faith and reason and Catholic social teaching and how all these things fit together. And so class ends, you always let students out a little bit early on the first day of class. The first and last day of class, always let students out early. You get higher teacher evaluations that way, especially at Notre Dame. I don't know about Dallas or Princeton, but so anyway, this girl comes up to me at the end of the first day of class. And she goes, she kind of had a snooty voice too. She's like, Professor Lange, my name is Megan. Oh, hi, Megan. How are you? My name is Megan, and I'm from Massachusetts. Oh.
All right.
I hear that's a great state. It is a great state. And you said that in this class, we're going to discuss religion and politics. Well, in my high schools in Massachusetts, I've learned that there should be an absolute separation of church and state. So I wonder if even in a course like this, we should discuss things from the church at all, in any way, in any manner, because we might be violating the separation of church and state. So I said, well, Megan, as you know, one of the great things that we get to do in philosophy classes is question our prejudices. So this class will be a great opportunity for you to question all of the prejudices you learned growing up in Massachusetts.
How did Megan think that?
She went, and walked out.
And then she dropped her class.
She didn't drop the class.
She didn't?
She didn't drop the class.
All right.